Third speaker will be Jane Hardy. She's a professor in the business school at the University of Hertfordshire. Her research includes foreign investment and labor movements in Eastern Europe. And she wrote a book that was widely discussed a few years ago called Poland's New Capitalism, out by Pluto Press.
Okay, thanks. I'm not sure how much Canadians look over the pond and follow what's going on in the Eurozone. But since 2009, it has been in almost complete meltdown on 2 occasions, to the extent that Barack Obama was on the phone to the powers that be in Brussels. The Chinese premier was on the phone saying, you must sort this mess out because Europe is such an important linchpin of global capitalism. Now, in between these near meltdowns, there have been a whole series of individual countries that needed bailing out, and of individual banks which collapsed or nearly collapsed. And that has been the picture until very recently. But the first point that I want to make is that although you could be forgiven for thinking that the euro crisis has gone away, because there haven't been any near meltdowns or near bankruptcies of banks, the first thing that I want to argue is that the Eurozone crisis has been kicked into the long grass. It hasn't gone away. And I don't want to bamboozle people with economics, but I'm going to make 3 points that I think are important. The first one is that Kevin's made the point about this being the longest, deepest recession. And the best way of describing Europe is that it is bumping along the bottom, with countries dipping back into what we call double-dip recessions, and the UK just about to go into probably a triple-dip recession. So, of course, none of this is made better by the swinging cuts that have been made in the public sector, which of course have meant that debt, government debt, has got even bigger, and of course we're told that even more cuts are now necessary. In the long run, there are 2 problems. Firstly, the ruling class within Europe have got a very deep structural problem, and that is that what the euro meant was it meant that countries that had lost their competitiveness, Greece, Spain, Italy, certainly Greece, they didn't have that get out of jail free card, which was to let their currency flow downwards. So what you have in Europe is a mirror image. You have on the one hand the weak economies with enormous balance of payments deficits, down, and Germany with an almost mirror image in terms of a surplus. So what the Eurozone does is locks those countries into a permanent structural crisis. Thirdly, that the problem hasn't gone away, it has been postponed. The European Central Bank, which was not going to bail out anybody, very quietly put in, I think, something like 1 trillion euros in long-term finance. And what that's done is it's put liquidity into the banking system and allowed countries to borrow money to buy their own debt. So for the time being, things are calm, but what it does is it postpones the problem until 4 or 5 years down the line. So those points are, perhaps a little bit bamboozling. But the point that is very, very obvious is that for working class people in Europe, the crisis is not over at all. They have experienced draconian austerity measures to the extent that in Greece and in Spain, officially 1 in 4 people are out of work. If you take young people in Spain and in Greece, 40% of people are out of work. And those are just the official figures. Most of us have had a pay cut because our wages have been frozen. If you live in Romania, overnight and you're a public sector worker, your wages were cut by 25%. Same in Ireland, I think around 15%, and also the same in Greece. So, in short, the austerity measures which have been foisted on people have brought economic and human catastrophe for many people. Now, unfortunately, there is nothing automatic about the fact that plunging living standards mean an automatic radicalisation of people and a move to the left. One of the really disturbing things that's happened in Europe has been the growth of not just the far right, people who've got right-wing and unpleasant ideas, but the growth of fascist parties. So that in Greece, the Golden Dawn received 7% of the votes in the last election. They were nowhere, they were a marginal, rather crackpot group, but now they are they offer, unfortunately, a way out for working class people. And what it's led to is scapegoating of migrant workers and physical attacks. In Hungary, actually didn't receive a huge amount of publicity, but there are 47 fascists in parliament, fascists who wear uniforms and who are given to goose stepping. So these sorts of developments are really worrying. That's the downside. The upside is that there has been an increase in struggle within Europe. First of all, really disillusionment with the mainstream parties, both social democratic and right-wing parties, has led to the growth of some new parties on the left. Now, some experiments, and I'm afraid the one in the UK, was not particularly successful, but in places like Germany, there is a party called Die Linke, in Portugal, a party called the Left Bloc, and what they've done is started to offer at least a more radical programme for people to organise around. And they've had varying degrees of success, but the sort of votes they've had have not been insubstantial. In Greece, 3 days ago, 4 million workers out on strike, and that is the 20th general strike they've had in the last 2 years, the 20th. And in addition to that, there are a whole number of sectoral strikes among steel workers, shipyard workers, teachers, university workers, and so on. And 25,000 people on the street against the Golden Dawn fascist party and their scapegoating of migrant workers. In Spain, the equivalent really of Occupy, which has been the Indigneros, huge numbers of young people who started off by occupying Plaza Sol in Madrid and which spread out to large numbers of cities in Spain. 3 months ago in Madrid, 8 hospitals were occupied by the doctors, nurses, ancillary workers who worked in them as a protest against the privatisation and restructuring that was taking place. And on the 14th of November last year, there were strikes, coordinated strikes in Portugal, in Spain, in Italy, against austerity. So there are some, real signs of trying to organise. But there is a challenge for socialists, and that challenge is how to turn protest into winning against austerity. And there are a number of challenges and the organisational challenges that as socialists we have to think about. For example, in Greece, there is a debate on the left between the group Syriza, 27% of the votes, a radical party which has been very, very critical of the austerity measures, and an anti-capitalist party received a much smaller share of the votes, but a debate about how Greece can win. Can it win within the European Union for slower austerity? Can it renege on paying the debt? And what would be the consequences of that? There's that debate. In Spain, there's another debate, which is the trade union movement is relatively not particularly dense. But how does the trade union movement connect with large numbers of very angry young people who are not in trade unions, either because they don't work at all or because they're in poor temporary jobs? Okay, just to finish, I want to come back to the UK, which is obviously closer to home for me, and to talk about how we can build an anti-austerity movement that can bring down the coalition government, which is weak, fragile, has all sorts of problems about its own direction. And I want to talk about the struggle that we had over public sector pensions, because this has been the real focus for trade union activity. And you'll not be surprised to know that the usual formula applies, which is you pay more, 10% of your salary now, so of course a lot of young people are thinking that they won't even bother paying into a pension, 10% of your salary to work until you're 65 to receive less. Now that really isn't very much of a deal. And there was huge anger around that. And, sorry?
Sounds good in the States.
Okay. And in November 2011, we had the biggest trade union strike, actually that I can remember in my lifetime, which as each year goes on, seems to get longer and longer. And normally in Britain, everyone gets on a coach and they pile down to London. If you live in Glasgow, you've got quite a long way to travel. But that's what we normally do. This strike meant that in every city and every small town, there was a demonstration and a rally. And that was nurses, it was teachers, it was local authority workers, huge anger against pensions. Unfortunately, defeat was snatched from the jaws of victory as some trade unions rushed to sign a deal which really completely demobilised the struggle on pensions. And I think that's a real problem. I think it's a real problem about how we organise in our workplaces to win. Now, before I conclude, that doesn't mean to say that in the UK everyone is completely demobilised. What it did is threw away a chance of a united fight to defend pensions that could have then been used to address much bigger questions. But there are disputes going on in the UK all the time. One small part of London, a very poor part of London, 2 weeks ago, had 25,000 people on the streets defending their hospitals. There's a whole rash of disputes stopping schools, in effect, being privatised, victimisations in universities and colleges, and so on. So lots of sporadic struggle on the ground. So to conclude, I think for us there are 4 challenges. One, which is how we go back, rather than, if you like, the sort of guerrilla warfare that's going on at the moment, with parents and teachers trying to stop a school being privatised, with universities trying to stop a private company coming in, how we develop that into a national fight, which would be a lot stronger. Secondly, so that trade union leaders can't sign the sort of deals that people are disappointed with, how we build a movement on the ground, a groundswell, so that that pushes our leaders to the left and not to sign deals which sign away important rights. And thirdly, I would argue for what I would call a political trade unionism. So that when we talk about defending our wages, when we talk about pensions, when we talk about those things, it's not, if you like, a narrow economic defensive demand, but we tie it in to defending all of public education, all of our public hospitals, and those things that we tie together. So there are links between trade unions and between communities. And the final task is how we bring those things together to much wider movements. So those wider movements of people who are marching to defend their hospitals can link up with people who work in hospitals like they have done in Madrid. So there is everything to play for, but I think as activists, as community activists, as people in trade unions, we've got a number of challenges which we have to face. But the opportunity is there, and as we say, they are few and we are many.